Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. Jill Abbott returned to Genoa City like a living ghost wrapped in strength, grace, and desolation all at formerly, stepping off the spurt with her head shaved smooth, her chin straight, and her eyes blazing with a resoluteness that both alarmed and inspired everyone who saw her, because this wasn't the Jill they flashed back the sharp-tongued commercial legionnaire. The woman who could slice through boardrooms with a smile, but a mama who had goggled death in the face and decided she'd not hide from it for one further alternate, and word spread through Genoa City in a twinkle that Jill was back, that the cancer had taken her hair but not her fire, that she had refused hairpieces and scarves and pity, choosing rather to show the world exactly what this complaint had done to her body without letting it touch her soul. And when Billy Abbott saw her for the first time standing in the Chancellor living room, sun catching on her bare crown, he sat like a little boy again. His breath hitching as gashes incontinently filled his eyes, because in that single moment every fight, every treason, every harsh word they had ever changed dissolved into nothing, replaced by the brutal clarity that he was about to lose the one person who had loved him fiercely and unapologetically his entire life. And Jill smiled at him. God, she smiled, reaching out her arms and saying his name the way only a mama can, soft and commanding each at formerly, and Billy crossed the room in three unsteady way before collapsing against her, blubbing into her shoulder as she held him tightly, brooding that she was proud of him, that she had always been proud, indeed when she yelled, indeed when she pushed, indeed when she demanded further than he allowed he could give, because that was her way of loving him. And Genoa City watched in stupefied silence as the woman who had erected conglomerates now concentrated all her remaining strength on one final charge, making sure her son knew he was loved beyond measure. Jill claimed on seeing everyone, Jack, Ashley, Nina, indeed old adversaries, because she wanted no untreated business, no moping bitterness poisoning the recollections she'd leave before, and she walked into society events bald and radiant, refusing to sit down, refusing to be hidden down, daring anyone to look at her with anything other than respect. And Billy stayed by her side like a shadow, alarmed that if he blinked she might vanish, laughing too loudly at her jokes, adhering to every word, every shriek, every participated regard, because the verity was clawing at his casket day and night. The cancer was winning, and no quantum of plutocrat, power, or stubborn Abbott pride could stop it. And the night at half the night Jill Abbott failed was cruelly quiet, no dramatic storm, no warning signs, just a peaceful hush in the sanitarium room where Jill lay pale and frail, her breathing shallow but her eyes still sharp as Billy sat beside her, holding her hand like he did when he was a child, hysterical of the dark. And she told him not to be spooked, told him that this wasn't the end but a transition, told him that maters no way really leave their children, that she'd be in every stubborn study, every reckless decision, every moment he stood up and fought when it would have been easier to run. And Billy tried to be stalwart for her, he really did, but when her fritters tensed weakly around his and she rumored, "I love you, my boy," one last time before her casket stilled and the machines went silent, commodity inside Billy Abbott shattered beyond form, and the sound that came out of him wasn't a man's cry but a child's wail, raw and broken and hysterical as he collapsed against her breathless body, soliciting her to wake up, to yell at him, to call him an idiot one further time, pounding his fists against the mattress as nursers gently tried to pull him back and Jack rushed by, affrighted, belting his arms around his family as Billy screamed that he couldn't do this without her, that she wasn't allowed to leave, that she promised she'd fight. And Genoa City would latterly brood about that moment, about how the potent Jill Abbott left this world not with weakness but with quality, leaving behind a son hugely undone by grief. And in the days that followed Billy moved through the burial like a ghost himself, gaping at Jill's portrayal, bald, smiling, unbowed, and realizing that her strength had been a gift she had been trying to pass on to him each on, that every harsh assignment, every insolvable standard had been her way of preparing him for a world that would not be kind. And as he stood at her grave, gashes streaming freely, he eventually understood the depth of her love, covenanting through broken heartbreaks that he'd recognize her not by being perfect but by being intrepid, because that was Jill Abbott's heritage, and Genoa City would no way forget the day she came home shaved, unashamed, unbroken, or the night her son cried hysterically as the topmost force of his life slipped still into eternity, leaving in pain that would no way fade but a love that would no way die. In the weeks after Jill Abbott's death, Genoa City didn't simply mourn, it shifted, like the axis of power itself had listed, because Jill was further than a woman, further than a mama, further than a business Goliath. She was an anchor, and without her, Billy Abbott felt untethered, drifting through days that blurred together in a haze of grief, guilt, and unsupportable silence, waking up each morning reaching artificially for his phone to call her before flashing back with a fresh, brutal stab every single time, that there would be no sharp-uttered greeting, no unasked advice, no pointed review disguised as love staying for him on the other end, and those moments were the worst, when the consummation hit each over again and knocked the breath from his lungs, leaving him doubled over, fists gripped, gashes discovering despite his hopeless attempts to be strong like she had asked him to be, because how was he supposed to be strong when the one person who believed in him indeed at his worst was gone ever? Jack tried, God, Jack really tried, swimming near, checking in constantly, offering fraternal solace and quiet fellowship, but indeed Jack couldn't completely access the wall Billy erected around himself, because Jill had been his person, the bone who knew all his excrescencies and loved him anyway, the bone who fought his battles indeed when he didn't ask her to, and now Billy was left alone with the echoes of every argument they'd ever had, every time he'd brushed her off, every moment he'd chosen pride over tolerance, and the weight of those regrets pressed down on him until some days it felt insolvable to breathe. The reading of Jill's will was a turning point that no bone saw coming, because while numerous anticipated her to leave behind commercial contingencies and precisely colluded power plays, what she left Billy rather was commodity far more ruinous, a handwritten letter, shaky but unmistakably Jill, filled with fierce love and blunt honesty, telling her son that she knew he'd be tempted to tone destruct now that she was gone, that grief might drive him back toward old demons, gambling, recklessness, preoccupation, but that she was soliciting him, as his mama, not to let her death be the reason that eventually destroyed him, and Billy read that letter alone in his apartment, sitting on the bottom with his reverse against the settee, blubbing uncontrollably as he gripped the runners to his casket, because indeed in death Jill Abbott was still calling him out, still pushing him to be better, still loving him enough to tell him the verity, and for the first time since she failed, Billy didn't feel abandoned, he felt seen. But grief doesn't heal in a straight line, and just when it sounded like Billy might be chancing his footing, the cracks began to show in ways that scarified everyone around him, because he threw himself obsessively into work, slightly sleeping, snapping at Sally, ignoring Jack's warnings, refusing to talk about Jill unless someone pushed too hard, and also the explosion would come, a glass smashed against a wall, a crying match in the middle of Abbott dispatches, a reckless decision made just to feel commodity other than the concave pang inside his casket, and Sally watched it all unfold with a admixture of heartache and helpless frustration, realizing that she was losing him not to another woman or another preoccupation, but to grief so vast it swallowed everything in its path. The breaking point came the night Billy eventually went to Jill's empty house, the one she had claimed on keeping exactly the same indeed while she was sick, and he wandered through it like a ghost, touching familiar objects, her office, her favorite president, the framed prints of him as a boy, until he reached the bedroom, where the scent of her incense still dallied noiselessly in the air, and that was when he collapsed fully, sliding down the wall and crying harder than he'd indeed. The night she failed, because this was when it came real in a way it hadn't before. Jill Abbott was no way coming home, no way going to walk through that door and demand to know what mess he'd made now, no way going to bail him out, no way going to fight his battles again, and Billy screamed into the empty room, rail at the macrocosm, at fate, at cancer itself, asking why it had taken her when there were so numerous terrible people in the world who merited it more, and nearly in that breakdown, buried beneath the rage and despair, commodity shifted. Because as Billy sat there in the remains of his grief, Jill's voice echoed in his head, not weak, not dying, but sharp and alive, reminding him that she hadn't raised him to give up, that she had fought until her last breath, not so he could drown in anguish, but so he could eventually stand on his own. And the coming morning, when Billy surfaced from that house with red-rimmed eyes and a hollowed-out face, there was also a new resoluteness hardening beneath the pain, a quiet determination that surprised indeed him, because he realized that recognizing Jill didn't mean adhering to the history or proving himself through vengeance and commercial wars. It meant breaking the cycle she'd spent her life trying to cover him from. He went to Chancellor next, standing alone in Catherine's old office, looking out over Genoa City as recollection swamped back, his mama's pride when he'd first taken the helm, her disappointment when he'd lost it, her fierce belief that he was able of greatness if he could just stop sabotaging himself, and for the first time, Billy admitted the verity out loud. He didn't need Chancellor to prove anything, not to Victor, not to Kane, not indeed to Jill, because she had no way measured his worth by titles or power, only by whether he learned from his miscalculations, and that consummation was both intimidating and liberating, because it meant walking down from the very thing he'd been chasing for times. When Billy eventually sat down with Sally, really sat down, no guard, no distractions, and told her everything about the guilt, the wrathfulness, the fear that without his mama he didn't know who he was presently, she heeded in stupefied silence before reaching across the table and taking his hand, gashes in her own eyes, because this was the Billy she'd been staying for, the bone who stopped running long enough to feel, and for the first time since Jill's death, Billy allowed himself to lean on someone differently, understanding at last that strength didn't mean carrying everything alone the way Jill had, it meant letting others help carry the weight. Genoa City would long flash back Jill Abbott as a legend, a survivor, a fighter, a force of nature who faced death without recoiling, but her topmost heritage wasn't a company or a fortune. It was the slow, painful metamorphosis of her son, a man eventually learning to live without her while carrying her spirit forward. And though Billy would always feel the pang of her absence, always hear her voice in moments of mistrustfulness, he came to understand the verity she'd tried to educate him from the very morning that love doesn't end when someone dies, it evolves, shaping the choices we make and the people we become. And as Billy stood one evening looking out over Genoa City, brooding a quiet pledge to the woman who had given him everything, he knew one thing for certain: Jill Abbott was gone, but she'd no way ever be forgotten. Billy allowed. The worst of the grief had formerly passed, but grief, he'd soon learn, isn't a single surge that crashes and retreats. It's a drift that keeps returning, dragging new wreckage with it every time, and just when he believed he was learning how to breathe again, Genoa City itself sounded determined to test whether Jill Abbott's son would survive without her shadow swimming protectively over him. The first sign came still, nearly deceptively so, in the form of whispers at Chancellor and Abbott dispatches, murmurs about leadership, about insecurity, about whether Billy Abbott was emotionally fit to be trusted with anything. At each now that his mama, his fiercest protector, was no longer there to bulldoze obstacles out of his way. Billy heard the whispers indeed when no bone said them audibly, felt them in the careful aesthetics, the unforeseen hesitance, the way exchanges stopped when he entered a room, and every time it happened, the old instincts burned, the appetite to lash out, to prove himself, to seize control before someone differently took it from him. But this time, he forced himself to stop, to flash back Jill's letter, her words etched into his bones: "Don't destroy yourself just because I'm not then to stop you presently." Jack noticed the change before anyone differently did. It unsettled him at first, the calm that had replaced Billy's usual volatility, because Jack had spent up most of his life bracing for his family's implosions, always ready to catch him when he fell, and now Billy wasn't falling, he was choosing. Choosing to walk down from meetings that felt poisonous. Choosing not to engage when Victor Newman baited him with thinly veiled dabs about heritage and weakness. Choosing to go home at night rather of staying at the office until dawn, chasing the vision of control. Jack didn't know whether to be proud or hysterical, because metamorphosis in Genoa City infrequently came without consequences, and sure enough, the counter-reaction arrived fleetly. Victor Newman, no way one to let vulnerability go unexploited, began circling like a bloodsucker, questioning Billy's opinions, undermining him in boardrooms, intimating to anyone who would hear that grief had softened the formerly dangerous Abbott heir at law, and when word reached Billy that Victor had appertained to him as untreated business, commodity cold and familiar, stirred in his casket the old contest, the old resentment. But rather of replying, Billy did the unbelievable. He went to Victor directly. The battle was quiet, tense, stripped of theatrics, and that alone unnerved Victor further than any outburst ever had, because Billy didn't hang or posture. He simply told Victor that if he wanted a war, he'd have to fight it alone, because Billy Abbott was done letting his life be defined by other men's prospects, and for the first time in times, Victor didn't relatively know how to respond, watching as Jill's son walked down with his head held grandly, carrying grief like armor. Rather of a armament. Still, mending didn't mean forgetting, and the anniversary of Jill's death impended like a storm on the horizon, casting a shadow over Billy's fragile progress. The night before the date, Billy slightly slept, visited by recollections of the sanitarium room, the beeping machines, the way Jill had gripped his hand with surprising strength and told him not to cry, not yet, because she demanded him to hear, and when the sun eventually rose, Billy set up himself standing at her grave before anyone differently arrived, the morning air cold wave and still, his voice breaking as he spoke to her out loud, confessing fears he'd no way dared to admit when she was alive, that without her, he didn't know how to be a son presently, that every success felt concave and every failure felt final, and as gashes slid down his face, he felt commodity differently too, a strange sense of peace, as if by eventually letting himself suffer without shame, he was recognizing Jill more actually than any grand gesture ever could. Sally set up him there latterly, standing still beside him, not trying to fix anything, not offering tropes, just present, and that presence meant further than Billy could articulate, because for formerly, someone was asking him to be stronger or better or less complicated, they were simply allowing him to be mortal, and in that stillness, Billy realized that grief had stripped him down to commodity raw and real, exposing the corridor of himself he'd spent times hiding behind bravado and chaos. It spooked him, how much he demanded her in that moment, but it also predicated him, reminding him that connection, not subjection, was what Jill had always wanted for him, indeed if she hadn't always known how to say it gently. As weeks turned into months, Jill's absence continued to ripple outward, affecting everyone she'd touched, and Genoa City set up itself reckoning with the vacuum she left before. Power struggles boosted. Old alliances fractured. New bones formed in the murk. Kane Ashby watched Billy nearly, recalibrating his strategies now that Jill was no longer the wild card he'd to regard for, and Phyllis Summers, ever the opportunist, oscillated between sympathy and computation, wondering whether Billy's grief made him vulnerable enough to manipulate or dangerous enough to avoid. But Billy surprised them all by refusing to play the game on their terms, stepping back from schemes that formerly would have excited him, choosing rather to rebuild ABBOTT dispatches with translucency and intention, indeed when it meant slower progress and smaller dramatic palms. The true test came when an extremity erupted, a fiscal mega-hit that hovered to destabilize everything Billy had worked to stabilize, and for a moment, fear surged, the familiar adrenaline brooding that this was the moment to go, to threat it all, to prove he was still ruthless enough to survive in Genoa City. Billy stood alone in his office that night, gaping at the megacity lights, Jill's voice echoing again, sharper this time, being stalwart doesn't mean being reckless. And so he made a choice that stunned everyone. He asked for help. He brought Jack in. He consulted counsels he'd have formerly dismissed. He admitted query rather of masking it with bravado, and though the decision bruised his pride, it saved the company, and in the fate, as Billy watched the extremity pass without the collateral damage he'd formerly accepted as ineluctable, he felt commodity dangerously close to pride, not the poisonous kind, but the quiet satisfaction of growth. Yet indeed as Billy moved forward, Jill's heritage continued to hang him in unanticipated ways, because grief doesn't vanish simply because progress is made. There were nights he still reached for his phone. Days he still caught himself preparing to argue with her over opinions she'd no way get the chance to notice. Moments when horselaugh turned suddenly into anguish because commodity reminded him of her sharp wit or stubborn adaptability. But rather of fighting those moments, Billy learned to let them pass, understanding at last that loving someone meant carrying their absence as well as their presence, and that assignment, painful as it was, reshaped him more profoundly than any commercial palm ever had. In the end, Jill Abbott's final gift to her son wasn't freedom from pain, but the courage to face it without running, to make a life defined not by response or rebellion, but by intention, and as Genoa City continued to churn with reproach, treason, and ambition, Billy Abbott stood at the center of it all, not as the reckless wild card everyone anticipated him to be, but as a man forged by loss, predicated by love, and eventually, ready to step out of his mama's shadow, not because it no longer impended over him, but because he'd learned how to stand altitudinous within it, carrying Jill with him into whatever battles lay ahead.